Let's talk about payments for ecosystem services. Payments for ecosystem services have become one of the most talked about kinds of environmental policy in the last decade and a half. When I was an undergraduate, it was like a new idea. There were actually payment programs that already existed, but it was like a big new thing. Now it's becoming very widespread. What is a payment for ecosystem services? The basic idea is that a landowner or some other person who provides ecosystem services in some way gets paid to provide them. And this is great, right? This is a really good way to incentivize people to protect whatever resources they have. So you can think about the golden-cheeked warbler in an endangered species in the hill country, right? Needs certain kinds of habitat, and we can pay people who own that land to conserve that habitat. If we pay them, we usually enter into a contract with them. They have to conserve that habitat, say, we are going to pay you for a certain number of years, we're going to pay you a certain amount of money, and we expect that you will conserve this, and we will have to check up on it every once in a while. You can think about a few other programs that are similar to this. So some people may be familiar with conservation easements, which are an somewhat older idea, but are similar. So in a conservation easement, a nonprofit organization or a government agency will buy an easement on a piece of land. Say this land typically cannot be developed either for a certain number of years or forever. We pay the owner of that land a certain amount of money, and they agree to abide by that. And again, we have to monitor this contract. We have to check up on the land. This can be very effective. There's a few disadvantages. One I've already mentioned in a previous lecture. Someone's got to pay for this, right? And there's a couple problems with this. The first problem is we don't like to pay for things. In this country, we like subsidies, but we don't like taxes. And you can't have a subsidy without a tax or borrowing money from somebody. So that's the first problem. But the second problem is that some people feel like this is kind of morally wrong. Like the golden-cheeked warbler has a right to exist. It's like we don't say to you, you know what, I don't think you should be alive anymore. I'm going to shoot you. But before I shoot you, I'm going to give you $150 because that's my incentive for me to allow you to shoot you. You know, that just doesn't make sense. So some people feel that say a payment to ask people to conserve is kind of the same thing. It's like, no, they should have to conserve. They own this resource that's a public resource. It's not right to pay them for it. That's an ethical argument. Not saying it's right or wrong. That's for you to decide. But I want you to be aware of the ethical argument. Now, there's another problem with these payments, which is that they don't always work. Why might they not work? Well, one reason they might not work is they might not actually be enough money to offset the costs of alternative land uses. So if you think about someone who owns golden-cheeked warbler habitat in the suburbs of Austin, you know, we're going to give you a payment of, I don't know, $5 per acre for the next 10 years to protect this ash juniper that's golden-cheeked warbler habitat. Or you could sell that land to a developer for $1 million, cash out, and they're going to build some condos there. Well, an incentive payment of $5 per acre is not that much compared to $1 million, right? So it's only going to work if we can really pay the right amount that is actually going to incentivize people. And sometimes that can be a lot of money. It might be cheaper to just require them. We might say, you know, you have this ethical obligation to protect this. You have this legal obligation. We're not going to pay you for it. So that's something to think seriously about with a payment. A second problem is what we call transaction costs. So if you think about it, if we're going to pay you, let's say I'm going to just pay you. Okay, that's fine. But let's say I have to pay 5,000 people who all own land. Well, I'm going to have to check on their land every year. And the amounts of payments are quite small. I'm going to have to pay someone to monitor, to cut the checks, to make sure that everyone's getting the right amount of money, to deal with customer complaints. suddenly this program is costing a lot of extra money that's not going into the payments. It's going into the administrative costs, the transaction costs. So some payments programs really run into trouble around this. They look like a good idea, but they're very, very expensive to administer. So I don't want you to think that payments are bad. Often they're very appropriate, but they have these issues. They're not a universal solution. Again, as Americans, we tend to like taxes, tend to not like taxes, and we tend to like subsidies. So we like subsidies. Now, one final issue with this idea, if there's too much transaction costs, maybe instead of running this big program, we should just buy it. And I talked to you about how provision is the missing sixth P. That was in one of my previous lectures. So provision, government can just buy it and provide it. And we do this a lot. Think about national parks and national wildlife refuges. Think about national forests, state parks, city parks. We just say, you know what? It's too expensive for me to pay this landowner, all these different landowners, to provide public access, to protect the species. Let's just buy the habitat. We do that quite frequently, and it's kind of like a payment, but it ends up with the government owning the land and administering the land directly. And sometimes that's actually a lot cheaper.